Sometimes a child's whisper in the rain can change everything. When a little girl heard a cry in the storm, no one believed her until they followed her into the dark. What they found on the train tracks would unravel secrets buried for years, and lead to a bond that defied fear, cruelty, and even fate itself. If you're moved by stories of courage and connection, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and stay with us. This journey is just beginning. The storm rolled into Winslow, Arizona, with the kind of quiet menace that made even the birds fall silent. The clouds were a thick bruised purple crawling low over the high desert town like a giant waiting to strike. Thunder echoed in the distance, and the streets usually lined with the golden glow of porch lights now glistened with the first touch of rain. October had brought a rare chill biting through the windows of the beige one-story house where the Walker family lived on the edge of town, close enough that the railway tracks hidden behind a thin row of cottonwoods sang their lonely song whenever trains rolled by at night. Inside the warm living room, a little girl knelt on a shaggy rug beside the wide front window, her palms pressed against the cool glass. 6-year-old Emily Walker was small for her age, with soft blonde curls that spilled across her back, and a pair of sea-glass blue eyes that always looked like they were chasing thoughts beyond the room. She was known in the neighborhood for her odd quietness, the way she often paused mid-play to listen to things others couldn't hear, wind whispers, birds no one else noticed. That night, her toys, little wooden dogs and foxes she had painted herself, lay abandoned around her knees. Her gaze was fixed outward, following the rhythm of raindrops that began to spatter against the glass. Julia Walker. Emily's mother sat a few feet away in an armchair, a medical journal resting in her lap. She was 39 tall and thin, her auburn hair tied in a tight bun, her face angular but softened by lines carved more from worry than age. She worked as a nurse at Winslow Community Health, and ever since the death of her first daughter Lily in a tragic accident 3 years earlier, she had grown rigid in her protectiveness. Her eyes rarely left Emily, as though afraid the universe would steal her second daughter away too. Despite her love, there was a distance in Julia's demeanor, like someone always listening for an alarm bell, even in silence. From the kitchen came the voice of Mark Walker, Julia's husband. Mark was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered with calloused hands and dark hair that grayed early at the temples. A mechanic by trade and the calmest soul in the family, he was stirring cocoa in 2 mugs, while whistling to himself, the scent of cinnamon rising behind him. "Storm's going to be a big one," he called out half cheerfully. "Radar says it'll rattle the whole canyon." Suddenly Emily stiffened, her breath fogged the window. Then, in a voice so soft it nearly drowned in the wind, she said, "Mom, someone's crying." Julia looked up from her journal, one brow lifted. "What was that, sweetheart?" "Someone's crying," Emily repeated louder this time. Her little hand pressed harder against the glass. "I can hear it. Outside." Julia stood startled by the certainty in her daughter's tone. She crossed the room and knelt beside Emily, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. "It's probably just the wind. It sounds funny in storms, you know that?" Emily shook her head, her curls bouncing. "No, it's real. He's crying. He's sad." Mark came in, holding 2 mugs, one for Julia and one for Emily. "What's going on?" he asked, his easy smile faltering when he saw Julia's concern. "She says someone's crying outside." Julia set her voice tight. Mark peered out the window, but the street was empty. "Sweetheart, no one's out there. It's raining like crazy." But before anyone could dismiss it, a sound cut through the room, faint but sharp. A whimper. It carried on the wind like a secret. They froze. Another came louder this time. Not quite human, not quite animal. A raw, pleading sound full of pain and fear. Julia rose to her feet slowly. That didn't sound like the wind. Emily stood, 2 eyes wide. "He needs help," she said. "Please, Mom. He's calling for me." Mark hesitated. The wind rattled the windows harder now, and lightning cracked across the sky. The sound came again, closer, clearer. An anguished cry that seemed to be pulled from some lonely place beyond their backyard. Then, without waiting, Emily ran to the front door and pressed her hands against it, her small body vibrating with urgency. "Emily," Julia called after her, grabbing her raincoat from the hook by the stairs. "Wait, you're not going out there alone. I'm going with her," Julia said quickly to Mark, her eyes flashing. "You get the flashlight." The storm had fully descended by the time they stepped outside. Rain sliced sideways across the yard, the wind tearing through the cottonwoods like angry hands. Julia clutched the umbrella in one hand and Emily's hand in the other, though the girl pulled forward with a force that felt unnatural for her size. There, Emily shouted suddenly, pointing past the trees beyond the backyard fence. A small trail led through the brush to the old railway tracks that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The cries were louder now, one long, ragged howl that dissolved into a broken whimper. Julia's heart pounded. Emily slowed down, but the girl let go of her hand and dashed forward through the mud. Julia followed, breathless and half-panicked. They emerged onto the railway embankment, the metal tracks glistening in the lightning flashes. And then they saw him. A dog. A large golden retriever, soaked and trembling, his golden coat matted with mud and streaked with something darker blood. His front paws were bound by a thick iron chain, looped cruelly around the track. Every time he tried to pull free, the chain bit deeper into his skin. His eyes dark wide and full of panic locked onto Emily's. "Dear God," Julia gasped. "Who would do something like this, Mom? We have to help him," Emily cried, running forward. "Wait!" Julia reached out to stop her, but slipped slightly in the mud. The train horn sounded in the distance, far away, but not far enough. "Help me!" Julia shouted to no one in particular as she dropped to her knees beside the dog. The chain was thick rusted, wrapped tightly around both front legs and twisted into the rail. "Mark!" She screamed into the storm. "Mark!" From behind, through the storm, Mark appeared, flashlight in one hand, bolt cutters in the other. "I saw where you ran," he shouted, dropping beside them. "Move!" With shaking hands, he positioned the bolt cutters around the chain. The train horn blared again, closer now. Julia wrapped her arms around the dog's neck as he whimpered, trying to calm him. One cut, two. The metal groaned. With a final squeeze, the chain snapped. "Go!" Mark yelled. Julia lifted the dog's front half, Mark grabbing his hind legs, and together they ran, stumbling, dragging him off the track just as the train screamed past them, a roar of steel and thunder that made the earth shudder. The dog collapsed in the grass beside them, panting, eyes glazed, but alive. Emily knelt beside him, placing her tiny hand on his muzzle. "His name is Buddy," she whispered. "How do you know?" Julia asked, voice trembling. Emily didn't answer. Her eyes never left the dog's. The storm had calmed, but its memory lingered in the air like a held breath. Rain still whispered against the rooftops of Winslow, now more gentle, like the sky had cried itself empty. Inside the Walker home, the living room had transformed into a makeshift recovery room. Blankets had been spread across the floor, towels laid over the rug, and a small heater hummed near the wet and shivering body of the rescued golden retriever. Julia sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, gently dabbing at his wounds with warm, soapy water. Her hands trembled slightly, whether from exhaustion or the adrenaline still draining from her veins, she couldn't tell. The dog Buddy, as Emily had called him, lay quietly, occasionally twitching his golden coat dull with grime and streaked with blood where the chain had cut him. His eyes, though dulled by pain, followed Emily wherever she moved. Emily, now changed into dry pajamas, covered in faded stars, hovered nearby, with a solemn intensity no 6-year-old should have. She had barely spoken since they returned, except to ask for more towels, more blankets, more warmth. "He needs us," she said once, simply. And that had been enough to silence any protests. Mark stood in the kitchen phone, in hand, his brow furrowed. No tags, no chip. Animal control says if we report him, he might be taken to a kill shelter since they're over capacity. He glanced toward the living room. He might not survive the night there. Julia looked up. "Then we're not calling them." Mark nodded, pocketing the phone. "I figured you'd say that." As she leaned back, a soft knock came from the front door, 3 slow raps evenly spaced. Unnatural. Julia froze. Mark crossed to the door, cautiously glancing through the peephole. On the porch stood a tall man in a dark green poncho, the hood soaked and dripping. His face was mostly shadowed, but the set of his shoulders was not threatening, tense, but not aggressive. Mark opened the door just a crack. The man looked up, revealing a weathered face, mid-50s, lined by years in the sun and wind. His eyes were a pale gray, steady, watchful. A scar ran from the edge of his temple, down through his left cheek, half hidden under a scruff of salt and pepper beard. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, voice rough like gravel, but quiet. "I saw what happened. I was the one who cut the chain." Julia stood now, halfway between Buddy and the hallway, instinctively placing herself between her daughter and the door. Mark hesitated. "Who are you?" "Name's Jack Rivers," the man replied, pulling back his hood. "I used to train dogs for the private sector. That dog in there, his name really is Buddy. I trained him." Julia's breath caught. Jack took a step back, raising his hands slightly. "Look, I don't blame you if you don't want company. I just came to check if he made it out alive." There was something raw in his voice, not desperation, but guilt. Mark opened the door wider and gestured him inside. Jack stepped in, removing his poncho and boots with a kind of silent ritual only former military men seemed to have. He wore a faded olive jacket beneath patches at the elbow, a military-style duffel over his shoulder. He had the look of someone who had once been precise and proud, but had let time and regret weather him into something quieter. Buddy stirred the moment Jack entered the room. His head lifted slightly tail, giving one soft thump. "That's a good sign," Jack murmured, kneeling slowly beside the dog. He didn't reach out, just knelt, letting Buddy sniff the air between them. "Hey, boy. You remember?" Buddy's eyes softened. Emily walked closer, silent. She stopped beside Jack and studied his face with an almost eerie seriousness. "You knew him?" Jack nodded. "Since he was a pup." Julia knelt beside Emily, placing a hand on her daughter's back. "Why was he on the tracks?" Jack's jaw clenched. "Because he failed." He sat back on his heels, sighing. "I worked for a private security firm based out of Flagstaff High Ridge Tactical. We trained dogs for bodyguard and assault work. Buddy was one of our top candidates. Loyal, focused, smart, but he wouldn't attack unless the target was genuinely threatening. He made a choice. Refused to go after someone. And that was it." "Refused," Mark echoed. "What do you mean?" "The person was a young girl. She was crying, scared, and Buddy just sat beside her. Wouldn't bark, wouldn't growl, just looked at me like I was the problem." Jack let out a dry laugh that had no humor in it. "The boss didn't take that well, called him defective, ordered him put down. I refused, I quit. But by then, they'd already taken Buddy. I spent 2 days tracking them. I didn't know they'd do something that cruel, not until I saw the chain." A silence settled in the room. Emily finally spoke. "He didn't want to hurt anyone. That's why he cried." Jack looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. "You heard him?" She nodded solemnly. Julia exhaled slowly, her hand tightening protectively over Emily's back. Jack seemed to understand something unspoken. "I'm not staying long. I just needed to see he was safe. If you'll let me, I can help patch him up better than towels and water." Julia hesitated, then gave a single nod. Jack moved with care and knowledge. He removed a compact medical kit from his duffel, saline, gauze, antibiotic, ointment, bandage wrap, and began to clean the deeper wounds. He explained his steps as he went, not for himself, but so they'd know how to continue later. "You've done this before," Mark said quietly. "Too many times," Jack replied. "Was a combat medic before I got into dog training. Some habits don't die." As he worked, Julia stepped into the kitchen. Her hand trembled slightly as she gripped the counter. The weight of the night had settled on her chest like soaked wool. The image of Emily running into the storm. The dog on the tracks. It all danced dangerously close to memories she had tried to bury. She remembered the hospital room, the still body of her first daughter, Lily. The way the monitors went quiet. The scream that never left her throat. Back in the living room, Emily sat beside Buddy once more. He rested his head on her lap, now eyes closed but breathing steadily. Jack watched them quietly. "She has something," he said to Mark in a low voice. "That girl, she's connected. Dogs know things we don't. But she might be hearing what they feel." Mark said nothing, just nodded. By the time Jack finished, Buddy's wounds were cleaned and dressed. His breathing was easier, less labored. The storm outside had thinned to a drizzle. Jack stood slinging his bag over one shoulder. "You're leaving?" Emily asked, sitting upright. Jack gave her a gentle smile. "You've got him now, but I'll be around, just in case." He looked at Julia, then Mark. "Thank you for saving him when I was too late." Then he stepped into the night, swallowed by the mist. The morning after the storm arrived with a fragile kind of silence. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, the clouds having lifted just enough to reveal patches of pale blue sky. The town of Winslow stirred slowly, as if unsure whether it had truly survived the night. In the Walker household, the calm was deceptive. Beneath the stillness of drying towels and warm mugs of tea, something unspoken hung thick in the air. Buddy lay curled beside the couch, a quilt tucked around his body like armor. His fur, now cleaner, still showed signs of trauma, a faint tremble in his legs when he slept, a flinch when someone moved too quickly. He was a medium-sized golden retriever, about 4 years old, with gentle amber eyes and a muzzle starting to gray. Despite the pain, he exuded a softness that drew Emily like gravity. Emily sat near him on the floor, cross-legged, whispering to him in a voice that floated just above breath. She had taken to carrying around a small notebook, sketching pictures of Buddy, each one slightly different from the last. In one, he wore a badge. In another, he sat in a field of flowers. None showed him in chains. Upstairs, Julia watched from the window. She wore a cream-knit sweater over flannel pajamas, her long auburn hair still loose from sleep. Her eyes followed the edge of their backyard fence where yesterday she had noticed something strange, an unfamiliar boot print in the mud, too large to belong to Mark. She hadn't told him yet. She wasn't sure it wasn't her imagination. That morning, Jack Rivers returned. Mark greeted him at the front porch, his stance tense but open. "Coffee's hot," he said simply. Jack nodded in thanks and stepped inside. He wore the same faded olive jacket, but his beard was trimmed and his hair slightly damp, as if he'd tried to make himself more presentable. Jack had the air of a man who had once known discipline and now fought to live without it. Julia eyed him from the kitchen doorway. "I don't remember inviting you. I figured you wouldn't," Jack replied, setting down a folded piece of paper on the table. "But you should see this." Mark unfolded the paper. It was a faded copy of an incident report. On it, in neat black type, were the names Buddy, Canine Unit 0417, and Rains Victor, Executive Director. "What is this?" Julia asked, stepping closer. "The report they buried," Jack said. Buddy was scheduled to be terminated for insubordination after he failed a final test, refused to attack a non-combatant. But here's the thing. That non-combatant was Victor Rains' own niece. She'd wandered into the training zone by accident. Buddy saw she was scared, crying. He didn't just refuse to attack, he shielded her, sat in front of her, and growled at the handler. Mark looked up. He protected her. Jack nodded. And they called it a defect. Jack leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Victor runs High Ridge like a war zone. He believes obedience is everything. If a dog hesitates even for compassion, it's seen as weakness. I tried to blow the whistle, but the firm buried the report and blacklisted me. I've been living off the grid since. Emily had entered the room without anyone noticing. She spoke softly. "That's why he cries sometimes, isn't it?" Everyone turned. She stood beside Buddy now, her hand on his back. "I can feel it," she said. "When he's sad or scared. It's like my chest feels heavy too." Julia's jaw tensed. "Emily, that's enough. She's not making it up," Jack interrupted. "Some children, very few, form something like an emotional resonance with animals. Dogs in particular, especially ones that have experienced trauma. They say it's rare, but it's real." Mark looked from Jack to Julia. "So, you're saying our daughter can feel what the dog feels?" Jack gave a tight nod. Or the other way around. The room fell into uneasy silence, broken only by the clinking of Julia stirring her tea. She didn't want to believe it, but something inside her had already begun to crack. Later that day, as Mark went to work and Emily napped upstairs, Julia stepped out into the backyard to hang a fresh blanket in the sun. As she walked past the fence, her eyes scanned the ground again and paused. A cigarette butt, fresh, and a second footprint beside it, leading away toward the road. Her heart clenched. This wasn't her imagination. She turned sharply and nearly collided with a neighbor walking by on the street. An older woman in her 60s, Mrs. K. Thompson, short and plump, with a red raincoat and a tiny white poodle named Max. "Oh, Julia." "Good morning," she chirped. "Morning," Julia replied, forcing a smile. Mrs. Thompson leaned over the fence. "That man who came by yesterday your brother?" "No," Julia said slowly, eyes narrowing. "Why, well, Mrs." Thompson adjusted Max's leash. "I saw someone much taller standing near your fence late last night. Around 10, smoking. Didn't look like your husband. He didn't seem to notice me, but Max went barking mad. I thought maybe it was someone from your husband's garage. Julia shook her head, trying to keep calm. Thank you, Kay. That's helpful. After the neighbor left, Julia walked back into the house and locked the door behind her. That evening, Jack sat with Emily and Buddy near the fireplace. The air had cooled again, but inside the house it was warm with orange light. Emily was showing Jack her drawings. She says he likes the field one best, Emily said. Jack smiled. Me, Emily clarified, grinning. Buddy told me. He chuckled, and for the first time a real smile broke the scarred solemnity of his face. Then I'll believe it. Julia stood behind them, arms crossed, watching the bond form with a mix of awe and unease. When night fell, Jack took his leave again, promising to return the next day. Julia watched him disappear into the mist once more. Then she turned and locked the door, double-checked every window, every latch. And still, even in the silence, she felt eyes. The temperature had dropped again, ushering in a brittle cloud-strewn evening. The moon was nothing more than a thin blade of silver overhead, veiled intermittently by wisps of clouds. The Walker residence sat in uneasy stillness, a single warm light glowing from the kitchen window, while the rest of the house lay cloaked in quiet. The peaceful illusion shattered just after midnight. A low, guttural growl vibrated from the living room. Julia jolted awake in her bed upstairs. Her breath caught as the sound rose again, deeper now, unmistakably from Buddy. She reached for the lamp and crept down the stairs, barefoot, heart pounding. In the dim orange light spilling from the hallway, she saw Buddy crouched near the sliding glass door that opened onto the backyard. His hackles were raised. His amber eyes, which had known nothing but gentleness with Emily, now locked intensely on the darkness beyond the glass. Buddy, she whispered, moving slowly toward him. He didn't blink. Instead, he growled again, louder, this time the sound rumbling up from his chest like a warning forged from instinct. Emily appeared on the stairs, rubbing her eyes still, in her blue flannel pajamas. Is someone out there? She asked softly. Julia glanced at her. Stay back, sweetie. They stood frozen in the living room, the mother holding the daughter, the dog standing as a sentinel. For a long moment, there was only the wind brushing through the dry grass outside. Then a faint sound, a snap of a twig, not from the wind. The next morning, Jack arrived just after dawn. His face, already weathered by years of desert sun and hidden guilt, looked graver than ever. As Julia recounted what had happened, he stepped outside, without a word, crouching near the fence line where Buddy had been fixated. He wore a flannel shirt tucked into old military cargo pants and carried a leather satchel that looked like it hadn't left his side in years. He moved with the efficiency of a man trained to read silence like language. I knew it, he muttered, motioning them over. There, in the softened mud where the morning dew had settled, was a boot print, deep, deliberate. Another print next to it, slightly off angle. And there, wedged under the edge of the fence, was a black zip tie, cut at the end. Jack picked it up and rolled it between his fingers. Julia's voice trembled. You think it's Victor? Jack stood slowly, his jaw set. He wouldn't come himself. But he has men, private contractors, loyal, quiet. If he thinks Buddy's survival threatens his name, he'll send someone to finish the job. Julia stepped back as her hand pressed to her mouth. So what now? We just wait for them to come back. No, Jack said. We prepare. That day passed in an anxious blur. Julia tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy for Emily, but her mind spiraled. Should she call the police? She had thought about it multiple times. But what would she say? That her daughter was emotionally connected to a traumatized dog? That a former military handler had shown up out of nowhere with tales of conspiracy and buried reports? It all sounded absurd on paper. Meanwhile, Emily's connection to Buddy deepened. She no longer simply sensed his emotions, she anticipated them. That afternoon, while Julia was in the kitchen, she found Emily sitting cross-legged on the back porch with her hand on Buddy's chest. He's scared, she whispered when Julia asked what she was doing. Sweetheart, he's just reacting to last night. No, he's scared for us. Buddy looked up at that moment, his eyes locking with Julia's. There was something in them that didn't seem canine at all, more like an understanding. A warning. At Jack's insistence, they installed temporary alarms on the doors and reinforced the backyard gate. Jack also retrieved an old camcorder from his truck and mounted it on the windowsill facing the back. If they come again, I want proof, he said. That evening, Mark returned home early from the garage. His graying beard was dusted with oil, and he carried the weight of disbelief with him. Though he trusted Julia, this growing paranoia unsettled him. "Do you really think someone's following us?" he asked her quietly after dinner. "I don't think," she said. "I know." Mark rubbed his temples, trying to keep his frustration at bay. "And Jack, are you sure he's not just feeding this fear?" Julia shook her head. "No, he's trying to protect Buddy. And us." In the corner, Emily played silently with Buddy, running a small brush through his fur. She suddenly stopped, her expression distant. "What is it?" Julia asked gently. Emily's voice was small. "He had a nightmare last night. It wasn't just him. I saw it too. A man with gloves. He held something sharp. He smelled like metal and cold." Mark and Julia exchanged a glance. Jack, sitting nearby, straightened. "What did the man look like?" he asked. "I couldn't see his face," Emily replied. But Buddy remembered the sound his boots made. The room fell into a hush. Even the crackling of the fireplace seemed to hold its breath. The night that followed came with heavy wind whispering against the eaves like voices from the trees. Julia hardly slept, and neither did Jack, who insisted on staying the night for safety. He took the first watch sitting near the living room with a flashlight and an old sidearm tucked beneath his flannel shirt. At 3:07 a.m., the motion light in the backyard flicked on. Jack moved to the back window and peered through the curtain. No movement, no sound, but Buddy growled again. This time, Julia didn't hesitate. She dialed the sheriff's office. "Someone's been in our yard," she told the dispatcher. "Twice. We're being watched." The night was thick with silence as the walkers packed hastily, adrenaline overriding exhaustion. The call Julia made to the sheriff's office had resulted in nothing but protocol. A cruiser drove by, an officer shone a flashlight into their backyard, but without a suspect or tangible threat, they could do little. Jack had warned her, if they're watching, they won't wait for permission. And so, under the early morning moon, they left their home behind. Jack led the way into the Coconino forest, the darkness alive with chirping crickets and the rustle of nocturnal creatures. He carried a worn backpack stuffed with supplies, water granola bars, a flashlight, a knife, and a small revolver holstered at his side. His movements were sharp but careful, his instincts honed from years in covert operations. The lines on his weather-beaten face seemed deeper now, shadowed by the urgency of the chase. Julia followed close behind, holding Emily's hand tightly in hers. Her tall frame, usually upright with the quiet confidence of a nurse, was bent slightly under the weight of worry and fatigue. She wore an old gray hoodie and jeans, her auburn hair messy under a baseball cap. Her eyes flicked constantly to the trees, alert to every snap of a twig or gust of wind. In the last 2 days, she had aged in ways she didn't yet understand. Emily, though, only 6, moved without fear. There was a steadiness in her gaze, an uncanny calm that contrasted with the tension in the adults around her. She walked beside Buddy, her hand often brushing his side, as if drawing guidance from his warmth. Buddy, the golden retriever with the torn ear and deep chestnut eyes, limped slightly from a reopened wound near his paw. Still, he trudged forward, determined, his protective instinct anchoring him to the girl beside him. They hiked for hours deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser and the air damper as they descended into a narrow gulch surrounded by pines. Jack finally stopped near a moss-covered rock formation and nodded toward a shallow cave. "We'll rest here," he said. "Just for an hour. Then we keep moving." While Julia unpacked the small first aid kit and tended to Buddy's paw, Jack moved away to survey the area. Emily sat beside Buddy, her eyes half closed, her fingers tracing gentle circles on his back. Her breathing slowed, her expression far away. "He's showing me the path," she said suddenly. Julia looked up, startled. "What do you mean? It's like he's thinking about it and I can feel it. There's a ridge past the creek with white trees. That's where we have to go." Jack returned moments later, holding a pine branch broken clean at the edge. "Fresh," he said. "Someone's close." He looked at Emily. "What did you see?" Emily didn't hesitate. The white trees past the water. Jack blinked. "There is a cluster of birch trees beyond the ridge. The girl's not guessing Julia. She's sensing something real." Julia hesitated, looking at Emily, then Buddy. Her chest tightened, not with fear, but awe. They set off again, quicker now. The sun was beginning to rise, casting gold through the canopy. They reached the creek by midday and crossed carefully, Buddy limping more heavily now. Julia carried Emily for the last 100 yards. When they reached the ridge, the birch trees rose before them like ghostly sentinels. They weren't alone. From the far end of the clearing, a figure emerged. A man, tall, lean in a dark windbreaker, and Jeans moved toward them silently. He had short black hair and wore dark sunglasses despite the overcast sky. His steps were slow but confident. Jack stepped in front, his body tense. That's one of Victor's men. The man stopped a few feet away. His voice was calm, almost friendly. "You've caused quite a stir, Jack. Mr. Hale would like his dog back. He's not yours to take." Jack growled. The man didn't respond. Instead, he looked at Julia and Emily. "You're putting your family in danger? A child shouldn't be caught in this." Julia's voice was firm. "A child is why we're running in the first place. This dog saved my daughter's life. We're not handing him over." The man sighed and took a step forward. "That's unfortunate." Buddy moved. Though injured, he surged ahead, placing himself directly between the stranger and Emily. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just stood immovable. Then came a rustling to the left. Another man stepped into the clearing, this one heavier, wearing a camo jacket and carrying a tranquilizer rifle. Jack swore under his breath. "Ambush!" Before the man could aim, Jack lunged, tackling him to the ground. The rifle discharged into the air, sending a dart spinning into the birch trees. Julia grabbed Emily and ducked behind a log as Buddy barked wildly. The first man lunged forward, but Buddy blocked him, biting his arm and forcing him back. The chaos ended almost as fast as it began. Jack held the rifle, now breathing heavily. The heavier man groaned on the ground. The other stood still, cradling his bleeding arm. "You can tell Victor this dog isn't a weapon," Jack spat. "He's a soul. And if he wants to silence that, he'll have to come through us." They bound the attackers and left them by a ranger post an hour's hike east with a note and GPS pinned to a tree. Jack had once worked for the government. He knew how to make people look twice. By sunset, they had reached an old fire lookout tower Jack used in his wilderness years. It was rickety but solid, stocked with basic food and a radio. That night, as Buddy rested his head on Emily's lap, Julia wrapped a blanket around her daughter and sat beside her. "You trusted him," she whispered, "even when I was afraid." Emily smiled sleepily. "I just listened." The forest changed as they pressed deeper, the soil becoming darker, the air damp with the spray of distant water. Towering spruce and fir trees loomed overhead like silent guardians. Jack led the way with a grim familiarity, eyes scanning not just the trail ahead, but the terrain itself, each tree root and mossy rock etched into his memory from another life. After 2 hours of hiking through dense underbrush and skirting the edge of steep inclines, they reached a narrow cliffside path that led behind a curtain of cascading water. The thundering waterfall spilled from a rocky outcrop 20 feet above, masking the hidden entrance beyond. The air was cold and wet, but Emily laughed softly, enchanted by the magic of walking behind the falls. Jack pushed aside a thick veil of ivy, revealing a small wooden door built directly into the stone. It creaked open with resistance, revealing a single-room cabin carved partially into the rock face. The interior smelled faintly of cedar and damp earth. A stone hearth sat dormant on one side, and old woolen blankets were folded neatly beside a cot. Shelves lined the back wall, still holding a few cans of soup, emergency supplies, and a rusted lantern. "This is it," Jack said quietly. "I built it during my search and rescue years. Only told one person about it, and that man's long gone." Julia glanced around warily, but nodded. Her body, lean and wiry from a life of constant motion, showed exhaustion in every line. Her nurse's instincts kicked in. She immediately checked Buddy's paw again, then helped Emily warm up beside the hearth, while Jack started a fire with practiced hands. As flames licked to life, casting flickers of orange across the stone walls, Emily sat cross-legged on a wool blanket beside Buddy. Her golden curls were tangled and wet, her cheeks pink from the cold, but her eyes still sparkled with a calm beyond her years. She whispered something to Buddy and giggled softly. Julia watched them, her heart aching. Something about that bond was deepening, something she didn't yet understand. Jack stood near the entrance, silent and watchful, his face weathered and scarred by more than time was drawn. "They'll be looking," he muttered. "Victor doesn't stop." Just then, Buddy's ears perked. He stood and turned toward the door, his body tense. Emily looked up at him, blinking. "He says they're close." Before Jack could speak, a low rustling echoed from the trees beyond the waterfall. Then, a metallic clank. Jack motioned for silence and extinguished the fire with a wet blanket. In the sudden darkness, lit only by the fading twilight, through the door's cracks, he whispered, "There's a tunnel under the cot. It leads out to the ravine downstream." Julia didn't hesitate. She knelt beside Emily and gently led her toward the cot as Jack lifted it. Beneath was a wooden trapdoor. The tunnel beyond was narrow and damp but passable. "Take her," Jack said. "Go now. I'll draw them off." Julia paused, her hands trembling slightly. "What about you?" "I'll be fine. I've done this before." Buddy stepped forward. Jack held his collar. "No, boy. You stay." But Buddy moved to Julia's side, then nudged her back gently. Then, without looking away from Jack, he turned and padded to the cabin's door, sitting there waiting. "He wants to stay," Emily whispered. "He knows?" Jack stared at the dog, the weight of old memories heavy in his gaze. Then he nodded once. "All right, let's make this count." Julia kissed Emily's forehead and climbed into the tunnel, Emily following closely behind her. They moved quickly but quietly, hands brushing the damp stone walls as they descended into darkness. The sound of rushing water grew louder with each step. Above, Jack moved to the window slit carved into the stone wall. He could make out movement through the trees. 3 men. One of them carried a shortwave radio. Another held what looked like a silenced handgun. These weren't amateurs. Victor had brought professionals. Buddy stood beside him, growling low. Jack looked down. "When I say go, you run. Lead them away." The moment came fast. A sharp knock hit the door. "Jack Rivers, we know you're in there." Jack threw open the door and fired a shot into the trees, not at them, but high into the branches. It scattered birds in every direction. Chaos. In the confusion, Buddy dashed out, barking loudly and weaving through the brush. The gunman cursed and gave chase. Jack rolled down the slope to the left landing, hard but running low and fast across the muddy ground. He circled wide, flanking them, as they pursued the golden blur through the woods. Meanwhile, deep in the tunnel, Julia and Emily emerged into a misty ravine. A narrow bridge of stone stretched across the stream. On the far side was another trail leading east. Julia helped Emily across carefully, then paused listening. A soft rustle. "Emily," she whispered, pulling her close. They ducked behind a cluster of boulders as a shadow moved above them on the ridge, another pursuer. He hadn't seen them yet. Then suddenly Buddy's voice echoed in Emily's head, not words but emotion, urgency, pain, warning. She looked up sharply. "Mom, Jack's in danger." Julia turned to her. "How do you—" "I know," Emily said, pointing back up the ravine. "He's about to be shot from the tree line." Julia didn't think. She moved fast and low, retracing their steps back toward the hidden ledge above the trail. From there she saw it, the glint of a rifle's scope aimed down toward the clearing where Jack had paused. She didn't hesitate. Grabbing a loose rock the size of a melon, she hurled it with all her strength. The crack it made against the sniper's shoulder was enough. The man shouted and dropped the weapon. Jack turned in time to see Julia ducking behind a boulder. "Julia!" he yelled. She waved and disappeared back down the hill. Buddy reappeared moments later, flanking Jack from the other side, panting hard but alive. Together they melted into the forest again, heading toward the trail. They regrouped an hour later at a safe point downstream. Jack's shoulder was scraped. Buddy had a new gash on his leg, and Julia's hands were bleeding from the rock. But they were alive, and Emily ran straight to Buddy, wrapping her arms around his neck. "You heard him, didn't you?" Julia asked softly. Emily nodded. "He told me where to find you. He told me you'd listen." Dawn cracked gently over the ridge, pale gold spilling through the canopy of evergreens, like a secret whispered to the earth. Dew shimmered on the undergrowth, and a veil of fog clung to the forest floor, softening every shape. The woods had transformed overnight, from a place of danger to one of quiet redemption. The long hours of hiding, of running, of trembling in the dark had drawn to their final act. Emily was the first to rise. Her small frame, wrapped in one of Jack's wool blankets, shifted beside Buddy, who lay curled beside her with labored breaths. His golden fur was stained with streaks of dried mud and faint smears of blood, his limbs heavy, but his eyes, though tired, remained watchful. He was a large golden retriever about 6 years old, with a broad, expressive face and eyes that reflected far more than instinct. They reflected choice, compassion, a soul that had refused to follow cruel commands and had suffered for it. Julia stirred next her body, aching from the cold ground. The lines around her eyes seemed softer now, as if the constant vigilance had finally loosened its grip. Watching her daughter sleep against the warmth of a wounded dog who had saved them all, it shifted something deep within her. Jack stood a few yards away, his silhouette etched against the rising sun. He hadn't slept. His jacket was torn at the shoulder, his salt and pepper beard more unkempt than usual, and his eyes bore the weight of long memory. Once he had trained dogs like Buddy. Once he had followed orders without question. But not anymore. He had spent years in solitude hiding from guilt until Emily had pulled him back into the world. Suddenly, Buddy lifted his head, ears twitching. Emily sat up. "He hears something," she whispered. They all turned toward the direction Buddy was facing. From the eastern path, faint at first, came the rhythmic crunch of boots on gravel. Jack stiffened, moving toward the front, his hand instinctively on the hunting knife at his belt. But the sound wasn't hurried. It was steady, familiar. Then came the voice. "Jack Rivers." "That you, old ghost?" Through the mist emerged a tall man in a forest green ranger's uniform. His face was weathered and sun-tanned, his shoulders broad and his gait confident. Ranger Tom Delaney, a longtime veteran of the Coconino National Forest. He had served with Jack years ago in mountain rescue operations, before Jack had vanished from the world. Delaney's brown eyes held a mixture of surprise and deep relief. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, stepping closer. "You're alive." Jack gave a tired grin. Not for lack of trying not to be. Tom's gaze swept over the group, Julia, Emily, and the wounded dog. His expression shifted. "You all look like hell." "We've been there," Julia said simply. As introductions were made, Tom knelt beside Buddy and gently examined his wounds. "This dog, you said he was the reason they were chasing you." Jack nodded. "His name's Buddy. He was trained in Victor Kane's illegal facility. The moment he refused to attack a child, Victor deemed him useless, ordered him terminated. That didn't sit right with me." Tom's brow furrowed at the name. "Victor Kane. I've heard rumblings, unregistered training camps, aggressive conditioning tactics, but no one ever had proof." "I do," Jack said, pulling a small waterproof pouch from inside his jacket. He handed it to Tom. Flash drive, documents, video logs, Kane's entire operation. GPS coordinates, too. Tom stood slowly, eyes wide. This is enough to bring the whole place down. At that moment, a low whine escaped Buddy's throat. He tried to stand, but his paw gave out. Emily rushed to his side and wrapped her arms around his neck. "I won't leave him," she whispered, voice shaking. "Please, don't make me. No one's taking him away," Jack said firmly. "Not this time." Tom gave a small nod. "I'll radio in, get medical attention here, and a transport." Within the hour, the forest was alive again this time, not with danger, but with help. Helicopter blades cut through the treetops as a team of medics, rangers, and 2 officers arrived on scene. Emily stayed by Buddy's side the entire time, refusing to be separated even as he was lifted onto a stretcher. She held his paw, her small fingers gripping the golden fur, like it was the only thing tethering her to safety. Meanwhile, Julia stood with Tom and the officers, explaining everything, how Victor's men had hunted them, how Buddy had saved Emily, how Jack had risked everything to bring the truth to light. Jack was silent during most of it, standing apart, until Tom called him over. "You're going to have to testify," he said. Jack nodded. "I will, but only if they guarantee Buddy a real life, not a cage, not a muzzle, a family." "He already has one," Julia said behind him, her voice clear. "He's coming home with us." Back at Winslow General Hospital. Later that week, Buddy lay in a recovery bed, stitches fresh, but his spirit strong. Emily visited daily. She brought him apple slices, read him picture books, and once even left her favorite stuffed bear at his side. Buddy never let it fall from the bed. Victor Kane and his associates were arrested within 48 hours. The facility was shut down. Over a dozen dogs were rescued, many of them already rehomed with families or therapy centers where they could be retrained gently. The story spread quickly through town. Headlines like "Golden Hero exposes training ring" and "6-year-old girl and her dog take down a syndicate" made national news. But to Emily, none of that mattered. All she cared about was that her best friend was safe. One sunny morning, just before Buddy was discharged, Julia found Emily sitting beside him with a drawing in her lap. It showed the three of them, Emily, Buddy, and Julia, standing under a rainbow. At the top, she had written, "Family means never leaving." Julia smiled. The sun poured through the window, warm and golden, and for the first time in years, she let it in. The town of Willow Creek nestled quietly against the soft hills of northern Oregon, where meadows shimmered with dew at sunrise, and oaks stood tall like old sentinels. It was a place where time seemed to exhale, a world away from the chaos they had left behind. It had been 3 months since everything changed, since the rescue, since the truth was laid bare. Since a golden retriever named Buddy became more than a survivor, he became a symbol. Their new home sat at the end of a quiet lane near the edge of town, surrounded by white fences and ivy-wrapped trees. It wasn't grand, but it was enough. The porch creaked warmly underfoot, and the swing swayed lazily in the wind. Julia Walker stood in the kitchen window that morning, her sleeves rolled up as she prepared breakfast. Her face had softened. The permanent tension in her brows, once etched by loss and grief, had loosened over time. She was tall with olive-toned skin and expressive eyes that held the echoes of sorrow, but also the spark of resilience. Years ago, she had lost her first daughter in a car accident, a wound that had locked her heart away. But now, slowly, she was letting it open again. Emily came bounding down the hallway, her chestnut hair tied in 2 uneven braids, her hands clutching a small cloth pouch. "Mom," she called. "It's time." "Time for what?" Julia asked, amused, drying her hands on a towel. "For the ceremony," Emily said seriously, eyes gleaming with purpose. Buddy limped gently into the room behind her, his gait still slightly uneven from the injury he had sustained, but his tail wagging faithfully. He had filled out since his recovery, golden coat gleaming once more, though there was now a permanent notch in one ear and a faint scar beneath his left eye. He was older now, in a way that no one could see but everyone felt. His presence brought peace. Jack Rivers arrived a few minutes later, knocking softly before letting himself in. He looked cleaner these days. His once wild beard trimmed his clothes well kept. Though still quiet, he had taken to joining them for dinner once or twice a week, slowly reclaiming his place in the world. He wore a denim jacket over a flannel shirt, and in his hand he held a carved wooden plaque. "You ready?" he asked Emily, who nodded with exaggerated solemnity. They all stepped out to the backyard, where a great oak tree stretched its limbs toward the sky. Its trunk was wide and weathered, and beneath it a simple bench sat in the shade. Emily led the way, Buddy trotting beside her, tongue lolling in contentment. On the bench sat a new collar, silver sturdy engraved. Emily lifted it from its box. "It's official," she said. "He belongs to us now." The tag jingled softly as she placed it around Buddy's neck. It read, "Buddy Walker, Protector, Friend, Family." And just beneath that, a tiny etched oak leaf, an emblem of where they began again. Jack stepped forward and handed Julia the plaque. It was hand-carved and read simply, "Bravery is not loud. Sometimes it's silent and golden." They laughed. They cried. Even Jack, who had not wept in years, looked away a little too quickly. Later that day, Emily sat beneath the oak Buddy's head, resting on her lap. She pulled out a photograph from the pouch, a picture of her Julia. Jack and Buddy standing in front of the tree in full summer bloom. She had drawn a sun in the top corner and scribbled the words, "Where it all begins again." Buddy's eyes closed as the breeze rustled the leaves above them. Julia watched from the porch, her arms crossed gently, her heart steady. There were new beginnings now. Emily had enrolled in Willow Creek Elementary. She smiled more. She laughed big, loud, unfiltered joy. The nightmares had stopped. Julia, for her part, began attending a local support group. She spoke about her first daughter for the first time in years. Her name was Lily. She had loved to sing, and Julia had finally stopped avoiding the songs. As for Jack, he took up a new mission. With help from Ranger Tom and a few contacts, he began assisting shelters that worked with rescued animals, offering his knowledge finally used for healing, not harm. And Buddy. Buddy was the town's quiet hero. Children would come by to pet him. Elderly neighbors brought him treats. On Saturday mornings, he joined Julia and Emily for walks through the farmer's market, his head held high tail, swaying with a soft rhythm of peace. But the most touching sight of all was the way Emily carried his photo and tag always together, even at school, even while she slept. It was more than ownership. It was bond, unspoken, eternal. The sun dipped low that evening, and as dusk painted gold over the trees, Julia whispered to no one in particular, "We're home." Buddy stirred beside Emily and let out a low, satisfied sigh. A new dawn had truly begun. The story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, a single act of compassion can rewrite the ending. In everyday life, we often pass by silent cries for help, whether from people or animals. But sometimes it just takes one person to stop to listen and to care. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment and subscribe to our channel for more stories that matter. What would you have done if you were in Emily's place? Tell us in the comments below.